My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 33 years old, an attorney, and if you'd asked me a few years ago, I would have told you that my life was finally starting to make sense. I had the degree, the career, the fiancé. I had spent my 20s clawing my way out of grief and debt and every cracked piece of a broken family. I told myself if I just worked hard enough, loved deep enough, proved myself again and again, things would fall into place. But that's the cruel thing about expectations. They're a trap disguised as hope. My father was supposed to walk me down the aisle. That was the plan. That was our moment. And yet, when the doors opened at the chapel and the music began, it wasn't his face I saw waiting to take my arm. It was a lawyer I barely knew, holding a sealed envelope with my mother's name on it she'd written before she died 23 years ago. I've argued in courtrooms with murderers, cried in the bathroom after impossible cases, and pulled all-nighters over custody battles where everyone loses. I've stood in front of juries with a steady voice while my hands trembled behind the podium. But nothing prepared me for the silence of my father's absence on the most important day of my life. I didn't grow up in a warm house. Ours was tidy, efficient. My dad, Richard Carter, was an engineer, precise, private, practical. My mom, Diana, was the opposite. Bright, chaotic, soft. She painted flowers on the walls of my bedroom and sang Aretha Franklin while folding laundry. She made our home feel like a heartbeat. And when she died suddenly from an aneurysm when I was 10, the color vanished with her. Dad changed after that. Not all at once, not dramatically, just slowly. He became quieter, angrier. Like grief hollowed him out, and the echo left behind was too loud to bear. He remarried 2 years later to a woman named Meredith. She was everything my mother wasn't: polished, conservative, stern. She had a daughter, Bethany, who was a year older than me and walked into our house like she'd been invited to replace what I'd lost. And maybe she was. I spent the rest of my childhood trying to earn back space in my own home. Meredith ran the house like a corporation. Chores were scheduled, silence was preferred, affection was rationed. I was 13 when I first heard her tell my father that I wasn't trying hard enough to adjust. Adjust to what? The absence of my mother? The cold shoulder from a woman who never called me by my nickname? The way my father looked past me at dinner, his eyes scanning the newspaper like I was background noise? I learned early not to expect comfort. I built my armor with honor rolls and track medals, then later with law school scholarships and a resume that made strangers proud even if my own family never said it. My father and we were functional, on paper. We exchanged holiday cards, emails about taxes, and obligatory phone calls on birthdays. But we never really recovered. Still, when Jonah proposed, when this man I loved more than anything in the world dropped to one knee with trembling fingers and whispered, "Naomi, you're my home," I thought maybe, just maybe, this was a chance to reset everything. To rewrite the narrative. To be the daughter who had it all figured out, who made her father proud by building something real. We planned the wedding modestly but with meaning. I asked Dad early on if he would walk me down the aisle. He didn't say no. He just said, "Let's see how things go." And somehow, I took that as a yes. I should have known better. It wasn't until the morning of the wedding, while I sat in my dressing room surrounded by soft chiffon and white roses, that I got the text. "Dad, I won't be attending. Please understand I can't support this. You've made your choice." That was it. No call. No explanation. Just the cold flick of a blade across everything I thought we were rebuilding. Miami best friend since college was the first to notice my face. She rushed over, heels clicking, concern pouring out of her in waves. "Naomi, what's wrong?" I handed her the phone. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. She read the text, her mouth tightening into a line of rage. "What the hell is this?" she hissed. "Are you okay?" I nodded. Then shook my head. Then just collapsed into her arms, because the tears came too fast for any brave face I'd planned to wear that day. But here's the thing. Even then, I didn't know the full story. I didn't know what secrets had been buried alongside my mother. I didn't know what my father had done or failed to do. I didn't know that a stranger in a charcoal suit would show up just before the ceremony, holding a letter from a dead woman that would ignite everything I thought I understood about loyalty, love, and legacy. All I knew then was that the seat meant for my father would be empty and that the man taking his place was carrying a truth that would unravel my family, word by word. If wedding days are supposed to sparkle like champagne and memories be etched in soft focus light, then this was an implosion. My dress hugged me like a promise I could no longer believe in, and every breath felt brittle, as though inhaling might crack me open. I watched from the veil's delicate mesh as the guests took their seats, their murmurs echoing in the hush of the old chapel wooden pews polished by decades of whispered prayers and confessions. I wanted to say something, anything. I'm sorry. I love you. This isn't who I am anymore, but the words lodged in my throat like splinters. I tried to steady my hands on the bouquet, the petals white as lies, but my fingertips trembled, and I wondered for the first time if I'd made the right choice. Then, as the prelude music began those swelling strings I'd selected from the first week I was engaged, I caught sight of Jonah stepping into the aisle. His face lit with hope and a heartfelt smile. I realized I might have broken by asking him to be mine forever in a universe where my father refused to walk me down the aisle. His smile faltered when he saw my expression. I could read the fear in his eyes even from 30 feet away, because we'd known each other long enough to trace each other's heartbreak in micro-expressions. Every inch closer to the altar felt like descending into a storm I wasn't prepared for, even though I had built my career on unpreparedness and the ability to think fast, speak truth, and stand firm. But this wasn't legal wrangling. This was family. And in that moment, I felt like a child again, lost amid figures I no longer recognized. My minister, Reverend Caldwell, cleared his throat and began with a prayer, his voice even and calm. Friends and family, we are here today to witness the union of Naomi Carter and Jonah Ellis. At my name, 1,000 shards of anticipation fractured my lull of calm. I imagined Dad sitting beside me, his hand warm, reassuring, enough to settle every tremor, and I gasped as the image vanished, leaving behind a seat that would remain vacant. I stared at the empty space and everything unraveled. Every missed birthday hug, every dinner we never had, every time he chose politeness over protection. The chapel felt cavernous, hollowed out. I don't remember at what point the lawyer Michael Reynolds appeared. One moment I was holding my breath, clinging to the promise of I do, and the next, he approached my side. Beside my groom and to the left of the minister, he stood with that envelope folded under one arm, eyes neutral as though he were delivering a verdict rather than a message. I wanted to ask who the hell he was, what right he had to invade my day, but the words didn't come. Instead, a cold shiver crept up my spine. I forced myself to focus on Jonah's hand as he slid into mine, his calloused finger touching mine, an anchor in the chaos. It was what kept me standing as Reverend Caldwell cleared his throat again, trying to continue the ceremony as though everything were okay. "My dear Naomi," he said gently. And that's when I knew it was my turn. My mouth opened, words like surrendered soldiers tumbling from my lips. I swallowed, because my voice felt brittle. And I pictured Dad's face one more time, the man I grew up believing in and all the history that kept him away today. But then I saw Jonah, head bowed, waiting for our union to be acknowledged, and I couldn't let the moment shatter entirely. So I exhaled and pushed through. "I take you, Jonah Ellis, to be my lawfully wedded husband." My words were a promise in a gauntlet of heartbreak, both a refuge and a reckoning. I kept going until we exchanged rings, sealing something that felt both painfully real and shockingly surreal. It wasn't until the vows concluded that Michael stepped forward, voice low and steady enough for the microphone. "Excuse me," he said, and there was a weight in the minister's pause, an awareness that something had gone fantastically off script. The guests leaned forward, murmurs flaring. I felt Jonah stiffen beside me, his grip tightening on my hand, as though bracing for impact. Michael cleared his throat again and said, "Naomi, I apologize for this interruption, but I have a legal document here that pertains directly to your wedding day." My breath caught. This was all too much. Too public. Too final. He handed the envelope cream, heavy, sealed with red wax embossed in an unfamiliar crest to me. Your mother wrote this before she passed, Naomi. She entrusted it to my care, to be opened today, on your wedding day. I believe it's something both you and your family need to hear. My heart pounded so loudly I felt certain the chapel could hear its echo. In that moment, I wasn't attorney or bride, I was just Naomi Carter, the little girl who lost her mother and lost her father along the way. The letter trembled in my hands, its weight more real than every ounce of happiness I'd carried down the aisle. Reverend Caldwell cleared his throat again, and he motioned for me to read it. I looked at Jonah. His eyes were damp, mascara raining down his cheeks. I looked at the guests. Some sat still with sympathetic frowns, others were whispering, reading the moment, the tension. I opened the envelope, breaking the wax seal as though opening a tomb. The paper inside was thick and folded in thirds, the sort of thing you only see in movies or fancy estates. My heart hammered. The guests watched, bewildered. Jonah squeezed my hand. I began to read aloud with a voice that shook as fiercely as my hands. My dearest Naomi, the letter began in your mother's flowing script. If you are reading this today, thank you for loving me long enough to remember who I was, even after I was gone. I paused, gulping air. My mother's handwriting, something I hadn't seen in over 2 decades, felt like a ghost brushing against my skin. The chapel was silent but for my voice. I kept going, but the words blurred with tears. I write this not as a farewell, but as a truth that must be said. Dear Richard, whatever pain my absence has caused, whatever distance time has built between us, Naomi deserves more than duty or formality. She deserves a father who stands by her when she needs him most. If you felt otherwise, then at least know I never did. I loved you both, and I believed in her even when you didn't. Naomi, my brave girl, I want you to step forward today with your head held high, because your life has always been yours, not mine or anyone else's to shape. Walk toward love without waiting. Walk toward trust without fear. Walk, always walk, because you are far stronger than anyone has ever given you credit for. I closed the letter and felt the chapel reel under me. The guests blinked, shifting in their seats as though waking from a dream. My father's seat, still empty, was suddenly louder than any voice in the room. I looked to where he should have been, but he never appeared. Just a record of absence, cold and undeniable. I blinked at Jonah, and he just nodded. His eyes said, he couldn't see you differently, so let's be you differently. I looked back at the letter in my hands and realized 2 things at once. My mother had left us a lifeline, even from the grave, and Michael Reynolds was no mere guest. He stepped forward, program folder in hand. My name is Michael Reynolds, he announced, voice rich with solemnity. I am Naomi Carter's attorney for family estate matters, but today I serve a different duty. Naomi, your mother also left instructions that, should your father refuse to participate in your wedding, should he refuse to walk you down the aisle, you are to be escorted by a legal guardian, appointed by her hand, to stand beside you into marriage. That guardian today will be me. A ripple of murmurs passed through the chapel. My knees felt weak. Was this real? Had my mother actually arranged this? It seemed like a fairy tale with barbed wire woven through it. But Michael's eyes were steady. There was a small, all but hidden note in his folder. He removed it, unfolded it, and read from it. To whom it may concern, I, Diana Carter, do hereby appoint Michael Reynolds to act as guardian of my daughter Naomi Carter at her wedding ceremony on the 14th of June, 2025, should Richard Carter refuse to fulfill his role as father of the bride. Respectfully, Diana Carter. The date landed in the silence like a verdict. Every second stretched in that moment, the minister froze, the guests pressed forward in hushed curiosity, and Jonah leaned so close I felt his breath against my cheek. I took a shaky breath and met Michael's eyes. Will you do me the honor? He asked. I nodded, tears streaking down my face, because the proposal wasn't just symbolic. It was a reclaiming. It was the hand my father refused to lend, but that my mother, through memory, through legacy, still offered me. My wedding became less about absence and more about arrival. It was about standing tall in the spotlight of my own story. That day didn't go as anyone expected. It wasn't perfect, it was every shade of raw, but it became real. A chorus of whispered prayers, moist shoulders, and the steadying rhythm of the music underscored something new. Grief could transform into justice. Rejection could be met with resolve. And a father's refusal could become the spark for a legacy rewoven by love long after its author had passed. I think the worst kind of heartbreak is the one that doesn't happen all at once, the kind that unfolds in small, silent betrayals, like drips from a faucet, barely noticeable at first until one day the floor beneath your feet is soaked, and you realize you've been drowning for years and never even noticed when the water reached your chest. That's how it was with my father. There was no single moment of abandonment, no dramatic declaration that I was no longer his daughter, no door slammed in my face, but rather a slow erosion of affection, a distancing that began with quiet disinterest and evolved into invisible exile. It started after Mom died, and I could see the shift in him, not the grief. That part I understood, but the way he began to pull away from me, as if every time he looked at me he saw too much of her, as if my existence was a living reminder of everything he had lost. At first, I tried to be understanding. I was only 10, but I tried to be quieter, more helpful, to make him smile again. I remember one night I stayed up past bedtime drawing a picture of the three of us together. I placed it on his pillow, thinking he'd tuck it in his wallet or frame it on his desk. But the next morning, it was gone. I found it weeks later crumpled in the trash beneath old newspapers, and I never said a word. When Meredith came into the picture, I had hoped things would get better. She was calm, elegant, and always perfectly put together like someone who stepped out of a magazine spread on corporate motherhood, and I thought maybe having someone in the house who wasn't weighed down by grief would help Dad laugh again. Maybe open up the cracks in our home where light could get in. But instead, it was as if she'd been assigned a mission to erase the parts of him that remembered who I used to be to him. I became a footnote in their marriage. She didn't shout or scold or do anything overtly cruel, no. She was far too polished for that, but every interaction carried a chill. When she spoke to me, it was clipped, impersonal, like I was one of her employees or a guest overstaying her welcome. She corrected my table manners with a disapproving arch of her brow. She changed the curtains in my room without asking, replaced my mother's perfume bottle on the dresser with her own lavender-scented spritz, and stored my mother's photograph in a drawer, because dust collects around frames. Each of these acts were small enough to dismiss if I wanted to if I was the kind of girl who could lie to herself convincingly, but I wasn't. I noticed everything. And so I started to shrink. Bethany, her daughter, didn't help. Beth was 17 and already driving when they moved in, and she treated me like an awkward pet her mom had forced her to tolerate. She wore designer shoes to school and laughed at the cereal I ate in the morning. I remember one evening when she brought her boyfriend over and introduced me as my mother's stepbrat. I laughed along with them because I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing me cry, but I remember hiding in the laundry room later, tears hot against my cheeks, biting my lip so hard it bled. What hurt most, though, wasn't Meredith or Beth, it was my dad's silence. It was how he let it all happen. How he didn't defend me when Meredith decided to turn my bedroom into a guest room and move me into the smaller one with no windows. How he barely glanced my way when I came home soaked from the rain because no one had picked me up from school and my texts had gone unanswered. I once stood in front of him, desperate, 13 years old and full of fury I didn't know what to do with, and asked, "Do you even see me anymore?" And he just blinked at me like the question confused him, then turned back to the television. By the time I was 16, I stopped trying. I kept to myself, buried in schoolwork and debate team. I figured if I couldn't be loved, I could at least be impressive. I graduated top of my class, got a scholarship to a top law program, and when I stood on stage in my cap and gown, I searched the audience for his face. He was there, of course, clapping politely, standing next to Meredith in her linen suit and pearl earrings. But his eyes weren't proud. They were tired, detached. He left before the reception ended and didn't stay for pictures. He didn't say, "I'm proud of you," or "You did it," or anything at all, really. And I told myself that maybe some people just aren't capable of showing love the way we need them to. But that excuse started to wear thin when I visited less, and he never noticed. When I stopped calling and he didn't check in. When I sent Christmas cards addressed only to him, and Meredith was the one who replied. The years rolled by, and each silence between us stretched wider, until the only bridge left was formality. He knew about Jonah, sort of. I had mentioned him briefly in one of the few conversations we managed to squeeze in during tax season. He's a software engineer, I said, hoping maybe Dad would ask more, show interest, connect somehow. He just nodded and said, "Hope he treats you well." Then changed the subject to gas prices. So when Jonah proposed, I hesitated. Not to say yes, that part was easy, but to tell Dad. I dreaded it. I rehearsed what I'd say, how I'd phrase it to avoid his passive disapproval. And when I finally told him, over a stiff phone call that lasted 8 minutes and 32 seconds, he responded with a flat, "Congratulations, I suppose." I don't know him well enough to say anything more. That was it. I hung up that call and stared at the ceiling, feeling like a little girl again, invisible in her own house, hoping someone might notice the way her heart broke without making a sound. There's a specific kind of pain that comes not from cruelty, but from erasure, from being edited out of your own story, replaced so quietly you almost convince yourself that maybe you never really belonged there to begin with. That's what my life with Dad and Meredith became. A long, slow undoing, not with violence or shouting matches, but with cold logistics and careful omissions, as if I were a minor detail in a life that had long since moved on without me. I remember coming home for Christmas when I was 27, during my second year as an associate at a firm where I worked 18-hour days and slept in my office more times than I care to admit, hoping a holiday visit might rekindle something between us, maybe even thaw some of the years between childhood and now. I arrived late at night after a delayed flight and a 2-hour drive, dragging a suitcase heavier than my hopes, and when I knocked on the front door, I wasn't greeted with warmth or even surprise. Meredith opened the door in a silk robe, her expression pinched, and instead of "welcome home," all she said was, "We thought you weren't coming." Inside, the house looked like it belonged to someone else entirely. Every trace of my mother was gone, every corner repainted, every photo replaced with portraits of Bethany and her children, framed with gold-trimmed pride and displayed as if they were heirlooms from a life I had never been allowed to be part of. My old bedroom was now a home gym, the treadmill propped where my bed used to be, and I was told I'd be staying in the basement guest room. "It's just more practical this way," Meredith said, without a hint of irony. I didn't argue. I didn't say anything. I didn't mention the aching in my throat when I realized there was no stocking for me on the mantel, no name written in glitter glue like there used to be. Instead, I told myself I was being childish, that adults don't need ornaments or place cards to feel loved, that I was above caring about that kind of thing. But it still hurt. Bethany arrived the next day with her husband and 2 toddlers in tow, sweeping into the house like royalty, laughing loudly, kissing cheeks, calling Dad Papa in a voice that made it sound like he had been hers all along. He lit up when he saw her, arms wide, face alive with joy I hadn't seen in years, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine that maybe he'd turn and give me that same look, that same warmth. But when his eyes met mine, it was like I was a polite neighbor dropping by for tea. Quick hug, a murmured, "You look tired," and that was it. The entire weekend was a performance, and I was the understudy no one told had been cut from the play. Every decision from where we ate to what music played was made without my input. At dinner, I was seated at the far end of the table, next to Meredith's cousin whom I had never met, while Bethany sat beside Dad, feeding him bites from her son's plate and calling him Gramps, like she was christening him into a role that had never belonged to me. I wanted to scream, to ask why no one saw me, why no one asked about my job, my life, why I always felt like I was auditioning for affection that never came. But I didn't scream. I just poured myself another glass of wine and smiled tightly through the ache. The worst came when Dad took me aside that Sunday morning, just before I left. We sat in his study, the one room in the house that hadn't changed much, still lined with books and engineering models, still smelling faintly of old paper and dust. He closed the door and said he needed to talk to me about something important, which immediately filled me with both hope and dread. "I've been reviewing the family trust," he began, voice flat, eyes fixed on a file in his hand. "And I've made a few adjustments." I sat up straighter. "Adjustments?" He nodded, not looking at me. Given how close Bethany's family has become and the support they've offered over the years, I've decided it makes sense to redistribute things a bit more proportionately. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already knew. "It means Bethany will receive the house when the time comes, and a larger portion of the estate. You'll still have your share, of course, just not as much." There are moments in life when the air leaves your lungs without warning, when the body forgets how to breathe because something inside has been carved out. That was one of those moments. I blinked at him, trying to understand how a man could look his daughter in the eye and tell her she was less deserving than someone he married into. "Because I didn't come home enough?" I asked quietly. "No, Naomi, it's not that. It's just Bethany's kids. They'll need stability. A place to grow. You've built your own life now. You don't need us the same way." I wanted to laugh. "I don't need you?" I needed him when I was 10 and he walked away. I needed him when I stood in courtrooms defending families while mine was too fractured to stand. I needed him every time I picked up the phone and hesitated to call, wondering if he'd answer or if Meredith would intercept with her frosty efficiency. But I said nothing. I stood up, heart pounding, and told him I had a flight to catch. He didn't stop me, didn't hug me, just nodded and said, "Drive safe." I sat in my rental car for 10 minutes before starting the engine, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing anchoring me to earth. I realized then that injustice isn't always dramatic or loud. Sometimes it's quiet, polite, disguised as practicality and logic. And it slices deeper because there's no villain to blame, just people you once loved who decided you were expendable. That was the moment I knew. I was no longer just being ignored, I was being replaced. It's a strange thing, realizing that the people who are supposed to be your roots have spent years pretending you're just another falling leaf, someone they can sweep aside when the season changes. And I think that's why something inside me cracked open after that Christmas. The part of me that had been taught to endure in silence, to take every slight and swallow it like a bitter pill in the name of family, suddenly turned sour, suddenly refused to sit back and pretend that my absence in their lives was justified, that my displacement in my father's will or in his heart was just some unfortunate inevitability that I had no right to challenge. I remember sitting in my apartment that January, wrapped in the oversized cardigan my mother used to wear on Sunday mornings, my laptop open on the kitchen table, legal briefs pushed aside, not because the work wasn't important, but because I was suddenly more interested in unearthing something. I had buried long ago the will my mother left behind, the trust documents from the house, the paper trail of what belonged to whom, and what promises were made before I was old enough to defend myself. It wasn't about money, not really. It was about truth, about legacy, about whether my mother's memory had been erased in the same quiet, efficient way I had been. Whether the love she gave me had been overwritten by new family photos and polite signatures. And so I did what I always do when the world turns its back. I worked. I filed records requests, contacted her former attorney's firm, pulled probate documents, and read through dusty files late into the night, every page another thread I hoped would lead me back to her. And when I found their original letter of intent for the family estate, handwritten and signed, naming me as the sole beneficiary of her assets, and requesting the house be preserved until I came of age, I felt something shift deep inside me, not joy or triumph, but a kind of vindicated sorrow, the ache of being right when all you wanted was to be loved instead. I printed the letter, read it aloud to myself, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry, not the quiet, stifled tears I'd learned to shed in silence, but the kind that came in waves, heavy and cleansing, because this wasn't just a legal win, it was a resurrection. My mother had seen me, she had known. She had left me something, and it had been taken, not lost, not forgotten, taken, and I couldn't ignore that anymore. The next step was harder, telling Jonah. I'd hidden so much of my family history from him, not out of shame, but out of fear that speaking it aloud would make it too real. That exposing those scars would make them permanent. We were sitting on the couch, his arm around me, a movie playing softly in the background that neither of us was really watching, when I finally turned to him and said, I need to fight for something, and it might get ugly. He paused the movie and looked at me, concern flickering behind his eyes. Naomi, whatever it is, I'm with you. Always. So I told him everything about the trust, about the will, about Meredith and Bethany and the way I'd been sidelined in my own family, and he didn't flinch. He didn't say it was complicated or suggest I let it go. He just listened, the way people do when they're in it with you, not just watching from the sidelines. And when I showed him the letter from my mother, he held it like it was sacred, like her words were more than ink, like they were a bridge between me and a love I thought I'd lost. Together, we drafted a letter to my father, formal, clear, respectful. I wanted him to know I had found the document, that I was aware of my mother's original wishes, and that I intended to follow through. I didn't accuse or blame, I just stated the facts. I sent the letter by certified mail and waited, day after day, checking the mailbox like a child hoping for a postcard from someone they're not sure remembers them. He didn't reply, but Meredith did. A short email. No greeting, no warmth, just, Naomi, your mother's will was superseded by the terms of the joint trust established after her passing. Please don't let this turn into a public dispute. We've all moved on. We hope you'll choose peace over bitterness. Bitterness. As if that's what this was. As if standing up for myself was an act of vengeance rather than survival. I stared at the screen for a long time, heart thudding, and I realized then that they had never expected me to fight back, that in their eyes I had always been the quiet one, the good daughter who left without a fuss and succeeded far enough away that I could be forgotten without guilt. But they underestimated how deep my mother's love still ran in me, how much strength she had passed down in her final words, and how real justice sometimes begins at home. So I met with my own attorney. I gathered the paperwork, the letters, the tax records, and the estate documents, and I built a case not just for what was owed, but for what had been stolen. It wasn't about bitterness, it was about refusing to be erased. Because no matter how much they tried to silence my history, I still carried her voice in my chest. And now, I was ready to speak. The invitation came wrapped in false civility, a politely worded email from Meredith that arrived on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing depositions for a divorce case that had already chewed through 3 mediators, and for a moment I considered deleting it without reading. But curiosity, or maybe the small, persistent voice of the daughter I used to be, stopped me. It said, Naomi, you deserve to know what they'll say when they finally have to look you in the eye. The subject line was simply, let's talk. The body read, we'd like to discuss the recent developments in person. Richard, Bethany, and I will be available Sunday at noon. Please come by the house. We hope we can resolve this amicably. Sikov Afirmani. Amicably. As if this was a scheduling conflict or a dinner menu dispute and not the dismantling of my mother's final wishes, as if stripping me of what was rightfully mine could be papered over with a few awkward smiles and lukewarm coffee. Still, I said yes. Because I had no intention of shouting into the void through lawyers alone. I wanted them to see me, to hear the truth from the person they'd tried so hard to keep at the edges of their carefully curated life. And maybe a part of me still wanted to believe there was something salvageable in my father's conscience. Sunday came too soon. I wore black not for drama, but for armor, and arrived at the house, the same house I had once raced through barefoot in summer, the same one whose walls had echoed with my mother's laughter before it was painted over in muted grays and quiet indifference. Meredith opened the door like a hotel manager greeting a late guest, her lips tight, her eyes scanning me for weakness. Naomi, she said, as if the sound of my name tasted sour. Thank you for coming. End of child. I stepped inside and was hit with the familiar scent of potpourri and lemon polish, the kind of artificial cleanliness that always made the house feel more like a showroom than a home. Dad was already in the living room, standing stiffly by the fireplace like a man preparing to deliver a weather report. Bethany lounged on the couch, legs crossed elegantly, her phone in one hand and an expression that said she had better things to do. I didn't sit. I wanted to keep the height of the truth between us. "I read Mom's letter," I began, without ceremony, without preamble, because we all knew why I was here. "I have the documents, the ones naming me as the primary heir to her estate, including this house. She left them with her attorney before she passed, and they were meant to be honored." Dad's jaw twitched, a flicker of discomfort, but he said nothing. Meredith spoke instead, smooth and rehearsed. "We're aware of the letter. But as I mentioned, Naomi, that was superseded by the joint trust we created after Diana's passing. Everything was updated legally and transparently." "Transparent?" I laughed, bitter and sharp. "You call it transparent that I wasn't even told? That my mother's dying wishes were quietly buried while you redrafted the trust in your favor?" "She was gone, Naomi," Meredith said, eyes narrowing just slightly. "We had to make decisions for the family." No," I snapped. "You made decisions for yourself." Bethany scoffed from the couch, finally looking up. "God, you act like you were cheated out of some fortune. You're a lawyer in New York, aren't you? You have your own life. Why do you even care about some dusty house and old furniture?" I turned to her, fury rising like a tide. "Because it wasn't yours to take. Because my mother's memory was scrubbed from this house and replaced with your school portraits and baby handprints, and I was treated like a guest in the only place I ever called home." Dad finally spoke then, his voice low, worn. "Naomi, I didn't know about the letter. If I had, maybe, things would have been different." "That's not true," I said, softer now but no less certain. "You didn't want to know. You wanted easy. You wanted quiet. And Meredith gave you both, so you let her decide everything, even if it meant erasing me." His eyes dropped to the floor, shame flickering too late to be useful. Meredith stepped forward, voice tight. "We're not here to be attacked, Naomi. If you want to drag this into court, that's your decision. But I suggest you think very carefully about the cost, not just financially, but emotionally. Is this really worth it?" And that's when I saw it, not fear, not regret, but calculation. She was trying to intimidate me, to guilt me into surrendering the way I always had. But she'd forgotten I made my living standing toe-to-toe with bullies cloaked in civility. I had argued down CEOs twice her size and judges twice her ego. "Yes," I said, standing taller, clearer. "It is worth it. Every page of that will, every clause in that trust, every memory you tried to write me out of, it's all worth it if it means reclaiming even a piece of the mother you helped erase." Oh! The room held its breath. Dad looked older than I remembered, like the years had finally caught up to him in this single moment. He reached out then, as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back. The space between us was not a gap, it was a canyon, carved from years of silence and complicity. "I don't need your approval anymore," I told him. "I just need what's mine." And then I left. Walked out without looking back, the weight of their stares pressing against my shoulders, but lighter somehow, freer, because for the first time in decades, I had spoken not just for myself but for her, for the woman who once danced barefoot in the kitchen and whispered stories into my hair, for the truth that had been waiting all these years to be set free. There's a strange kind of silence that follows confrontation, not the peaceful silence of resolution or the quiet that comes after a deep sigh, but a hollow, echoing stillness that feels like standing in an abandoned cathedral where your voice doesn't bounce back because there's no one left to hear it. And that's the silence I carried home with me after I left my father's house, a silence that pressed in on my chest and filled every corner of my apartment like fog creeping through unseen cracks. I didn't cry right away. It was too much. I sat on the edge of my bed, my coat still on, the door barely closed behind me, and stared at the floor for what felt like hours, hands clenched so tightly around my phone that my knuckles turned white. Not because I was waiting for anyone to call deep down. I knew they wouldn't, but because I couldn't let go of the last thread of hope, the hope that someone, anyone, especially my father, might finally see me clearly and say the words I had waited a lifetime to hear. But the phone didn't ring. And as the hours passed, it became painfully clear that the weight I was carrying didn't come from what had been said in that living room. It came from everything that had never been said, from the years of silence, of glances avoided, birthdays skipped, from the dull ache of being tolerated rather than treasured. From knowing that I could stand in the center of a room filled with people who shared my blood and still feel like a stranger passing through someone else's life. That night, I sat in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window, casting fractured shadows through the blinds. And I thought about every version of myself I had tried to become just to be enough for them. The good student, the polite guest, the overachiever, the quiet daughter who never pushed too hard or asked for too much, who swallowed her pain and kept smiling, who learned to nod and say thank you even when her voice trembled with what she wanted to say but never did. I thought about the girl who used to write letters to her mom and leave them in the garden, believing that maybe, somehow, the wind would carry her words to heaven. I thought about the teenager who watched her father kiss another woman goodnight while pretending she wasn't still waiting for him to say, "I miss your mother too." I thought about the adult who finally had everything she had worked for: her own place, her own name on the office door, a man who loved her for who she was, and yet still carried the ache of being unwanted like a phantom limb she couldn't forget. Grief is a shapeshifter. It doesn't just visit when someone dies, it returns every time they're missing from the places they're supposed to be. And that night, grief settled beside me like an old companion, curling into my chest and whispering that no matter how hard I fought, no matter how many truths I unearthed, some people would never love me the way I needed to be loved, and the loneliness that realization brought was heavier than anything I'd carried in courtrooms or closing arguments. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat up, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of a history I didn't know how to rewrite. At some point, I opened the box I kept beneath my bed, the one with the few things I'd saved from childhood, a photo of Mom holding me in the garden, both of us laughing, a dried rose she'd pressed in a book of poetry, a birthday card she'd written the year before she died with the words, "Always believe you are worthy," underlined 3 times. I held that card in my hands like it was a lifeline, the only proof I had that someone had once seen me clearly and loved me fully, and for the first time in years, I wept not the silent, self-contained tears of the courtroom strategist, but the messy, heaving sobs of a daughter mourning not just a mother, but the version of herself that never got to exist in the warmth of unconditional love. Jonah came home just after dawn, his flight delayed, bags in hand and exhaustion in his eyes. But when he saw me sitting there, surrounded by memory and silence, he dropped everything and crossed the room in 3 steps, pulling me into his arms like he already knew. Like he didn't need me to say a word to understand the storm I had just walked through. And I broke all over again, in his arms, my face buried in his chest, whispering through gasps, "I don't know why it still hurts. I don't know why I'm not enough." He held me tighter. "You are," he said into my hair, voice trembling. "You always have been." And even though part of me wanted to believe it, needed to believe it, another part, the hurt child that still lived inside me, wasn't ready to let go of the pain. Because sometimes heartbreak becomes your home when you've never been given a better one, and it takes time to learn how to move out. So I let myself stay in that dark place a little longer, not because I wanted to live there forever, but because I had to feel everything fully before I could begin again. And in that stillness, in that ache, I promised myself that even if my father never looked back, even if Meredith and Bethany never said my name with anything but resentment, I would keep fighting, not for vengeance, but for visibility, not to win a war, but to reclaim the story they tried to write me out of. Because even in the loneliest moment, I still had my truth, and I wasn't done speaking. The truth didn't arrive with fanfare or fury, it came in the quietest way, almost like a whisper, something I almost didn't notice until it was already reshaping everything I thought I knew. And I think that's how the biggest revelations tend to arrive. Softly, patiently, waiting in the dark until you're finally ready to see them for what they are. It was late, nearly midnight, a week after that suffocating confrontation at my father's house, and I was reorganizing my files to prepare for the legal steps ahead, scanning copies of the trust documents, outlining case law, gathering timelines when I found it, wedged between two case files I hadn't opened in years. A pale blue folder with my name on it, written in my mother's handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before touching it, as if opening it would shift the ground beneath me, and in a way, it did. Inside were three things. A notarized letter addressed to her attorney at the time, a faded Polaroid photo of me and her in front of the old garden wall, and a small, handwritten note folded so delicately it felt like something sacred. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. Naomi, if you are reading this, then I didn't get the chance to say what I wanted to say while I was still alive. I don't know what will happen after I'm gone, but I do know this Meredith is not who she pretends to be. I've seen the letters. I've heard the conversations when she thought I was sleeping. She's trying to convince your father that I'm unstable, that I can't be trusted with decisions about our estate. But I'm documenting everything, and I've left copies with my lawyer. Naomi, please don't let them silence you. Don't let them erase me or you. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. I read the note again and again, my eyes scanning the slanted, urgent handwriting, my heart beating louder than any sound in the room, and I realized what this was: not just a message, but a warning, a call to arms from a mother who had known even before she passed that something was wrong, that the foundation of our family was already cracking beneath her feet, and that the woman her husband trusted was not simply cold or distant, but actively manipulative, deceitful, and dangerous. I scrambled to my laptop, heart pounding, and searched for the law firm where my mother's estate had been handled. It had merged with a larger firm a few years back, but after a few calls and some painfully slow transfers, I found a partner named James Whitmore, who had been a junior associate at the time of my mother's passing. I told him who I was, explained the note I'd found, and asked, my voice barely steady, if there was anything in their archives, anything she might have filed before her death that hadn't been included in the revised trust Meredith later drafted with my father. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind that feels like standing at the edge of a cliff waiting to see if the ground will give way beneath you. Then he said, actually, yes. There is something. I will. The next day, I was in his office, barely able to keep my hands from shaking as he pulled out a file labeled Diana Carter Supplementary Addendum, Confidential. Inside were copies of correspondence between my mother and the firm, a signed affidavit expressing concern over Meredith's involvement in estate decisions, and most damning of all, a recorded memo, in which my mother outlined Meredith's pressure campaign to have her declared mentally unfit just months before her sudden death. I listened to the recording in stunned silence, my mother's voice raw but clear, speaking into a dictation device about how she feared Meredith was manipulating my father, how she worried for my future if anything were to happen to her, how she had already seen changes to financial documents that she hadn't approved and had begun documenting the discrepancies. The memo was dated 6 weeks before she died. And that's when the truth began to take shape, not as a simple oversight or family dispute, but as a deliberate silencing of a woman who saw too much and trusted the wrong person. Suddenly, the coldness of my childhood, the ease with which Meredith had taken over everything, the dismissive tone in every conversation, they weren't just symptoms of a fractured family. They were evidence. I left that office with a file that felt heavier than law books, heavier than betrayal, because it carried not just proof of wrongdoing, but the voice of a woman who had fought, quietly and bravely, to protect a daughter she knew might one day need more than memories to reclaim what was stolen. That night, I spread everything out on my kitchen table: the letter, the memo, the legal documents, and I saw it all clearly. The theft of my inheritance wasn't accidental, it was orchestrated. Meredith had manipulated my father into rewriting my mother's legacy, and he, whether blinded by grief or weakness or denial, had allowed it. And I was done grieving. I was done waiting. I picked up the phone and called my attorney, voice calm but resolute. We're going forward. All the way. I have new evidence, and I'm done being quiet. Because now, it wasn't just about a house, or a will, or a seat at a table. I was never invited to it. Was about truth. It was about justice. It was about honoring the woman who left me a voice even after death. And I was going to use it. There's a moment, right before you speak the truth you've kept buried for far too long, when time seems to slow, when your body tenses not out of fear but out of recognition that this moment will split your life in two, that the words you're about to say cannot be taken back, that the ground you stand on will never again be as stable as the lies that held it together. And I felt that moment in my bones as I stood once again in my father's living room. The file in my hands like a flame ready to burn through every layer of comfort they had wrapped themselves in. They hadn't expected me back, not like this. Not with evidence. Not with truth. My father sat in his usual chair, worn leather cracking beneath his stillness, while Meredith stood near the window, arms folded like a gate closing fast, and Bethany, ever the spectator when it wasn't about her, hovered by the door, her mouth already pulled into that practiced sneer. The one she used when she needed to look amused but wasn't smart enough to understand the depth of what was coming. I didn't bother with pleasantries this time. I placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it, spreading out the documents, the notarized letter, the correspondence from my mother's attorney, the printed transcript of the voice memo she'd left behind. All of it, like a final declaration from the grave. And I said, quietly but clearly, "This is everything my mother tried to protect. This is what you erased." All ending. Meredith's face didn't change at first, but her eyes flicked down, just slightly, the only betrayal of panic beneath that polished exterior. Dad leaned forward, his eyes scanning the papers, slower than he once might have, and when he read her signature, his hand trembled just enough to betray the weight of recognition. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice thin. "I found the letter she left for me," I said, not breaking eye contact. "It led me to her lawyer. They had kept everything, even after all these years. She was afraid of what Meredith might do. She was afraid for me." Meredith scoffed, a dry, brittle sound. "Diana was ill toward the end. She imagined things." "She wasn't imagining these legal filings," I replied. "She wasn't imagining you trying to have her declared mentally unstable. That memo she recorded it 6 weeks before she died. She knew what was happening." Bethany stepped forward then, voice sharp. "Are you seriously accusing my mother of what? Stealing from a dead woman?" "Yes," I said flatly, and the room went dead silent. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, but I didn't waver, because this was what I had trained my whole life for, not in law school, not in courtrooms, but in the silence of this family, in the art of swallowing pain and keeping my voice steady. Dad stood then, slowly, his face pale, and looked at Meredith with something I hadn't seen in years, doubt. "Did you know about this?" he asked her. She didn't answer. "Meredith," he repeated, more firmly this time, the engineer's voice returning, precise and demanding. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I did what needed to be done," she said at last. "She was unstable, you know that. She wasn't making rational decisions." "You rewrote her will," I said. "You convinced him to undo everything she'd put in place. You took the house, the trust, every asset she left for me, and you did it knowing she had tried to stop you." My father sat back down like his knees could no longer hold him. I thought we were just starting over," he whispered. "I didn't know she'd." "You didn't want to know," I said, softer now, the fight draining, replaced with the hollow ache of knowing the battle had never needed to happen if he'd only loved me enough to listen. Meredith walked out of the room then, without a word, and Bethany followed her, muttering something under her breath that I didn't care enough to decipher. And then it was just me and my father. He didn't look at me right away. He stared at the papers, at her handwriting, and something broke in his expression, something small but real, like a thread finally snapping under the weight of years. "I failed her," he said. I nodded. "You failed me too." I didn't know how to grieve," he said, as if that explained everything. "I was grieving too," I replied. "I needed you. And you left me alone with strangers." He finally looked up at me then, and for the first time, I saw regret, not the kind that asks for forgiveness, but the kind that understands it might never be given. "What will you do?" he asked. "I'm filing," I said simply. "This goes to court, I'm not backing down." He nodded once, slowly. "I won't fight it." And though the words didn't heal anything, though they didn't erase the years or undo the harm, they were the closest thing to an apology I would ever get. I gathered my documents and turned to leave, pausing only once to say the thing I had needed to say for years, not for him, but for myself. She was trying to protect me, and now I'm protecting her. That's what daughters do. Then I walked away, not from family, but from the lies they built to keep me quiet. Victory doesn't always come with trumpets or triumph or the neatness of courtroom closure. And when you've been fighting for something that was taken from you so long ago that your memory of having it is soft and fading, victory can feel more like silence than celebration. But when the judge finally read her ruling aloud in that small probate courtroom voice, even expression, neutral, I felt something lift off me that I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. Like a stone that had lived in my chest so long. I thought it was part of my body, suddenly gone, and in its absence, there was breath, lightness, a fragile sense of justice that trembled as it took its first full shape. It had taken nearly 4 months of filings, of legal motions and depositions and reluctant truths pulled from Meredith's carefully guarded mouth like teeth she never thought she'd have to surrender. 4 months of watching my father sit in deposition rooms, staring at his folded hands, of Bethany showing up to hearings in her designer shoes like this was beneath her, of watching Jonah wait for me outside every courtroom with coffee and calm. His presence, the one place I could still rest, but the facts had spoken, and more importantly, my mother had spoken, her words preserved across decades, surviving lies, outliving betrayal, and in the end, it was her voice the court chose to believe. The ruling was clear. The court found that Diana Carter's final testamentary intent had been willfully suppressed, that the joint trust formed afterward was constructed under undue influence and without full disclosure of prior directives, and that the amended trust and Meredith's financial gains as co-executor were to be reversed. The house would return to me. The remaining assets, liquid and non-liquid, would be reevaluated and distributed in accordance with my mother's original will. Meredith's appointment as co-trustee was revoked. She would be required to return funds she had withdrawn during the disputed period, and though the court stopped short of criminal charges, the judge made clear in her statement that a legacy was manipulated under the guise of blended family harmony. I sat still as the words sunk in, not smiling, not crying, not moving, because for so long I had trained myself not to expect this, not to imagine that justice could exist in families as fractured as mine. And now that it had arrived, I didn't know how to hold it in my hands without shaking. Meredith didn't look at me. Bethany stormed out halfway through the reading, muttering something about me being vindictive, which didn't hurt the way I thought it would because it wasn't true, because I wasn't here for revenge. I was here for restoration, for a mother who had once painted wildflowers on my bedroom walls and signed her name with loops that made every note feel like a secret hug. My father stayed until the very end. He stood slowly as the courtroom emptied, and when he turned to face me, there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years, not warmth, exactly, and certainly not pride, but a kind of quiet acceptance, a concession, a recognition of the damage done and the time lost. He took a hesitant step toward me. "You were right," he said, voice rough. "I should have protected you." Oh. And for a moment I felt that old reflex rise, that ache to forgive just because he'd finally said it, but I held my ground, because forgiveness, like trust, can't be given in a single breath. It's built over time, brick by brick, and he hadn't even laid the foundation yet. "I didn't need protection," I said. "I needed to matter." He nodded. "I see that now. It wasn't enough. But it was something." When I walked back into my house 2 weeks later, keys in hand, the rooms were colder than I remembered, emptier, stripped of the ornaments and rearrangements that had made it feel like Meredith's gallery rather than my mother's home, and yet, beneath the surface, I could still sense her, in the curve of the banister, in the sunlit window seat she used to read by, in the quiet hum of the floorboards that remembered the rhythm of her steps. I wandered from room to room, fingers trailing over familiar surfaces, and I didn't cry. I just breathed, slowly, deeply, knowing that I had reclaimed something that belonged not just to me, but to the woman who had once trusted love enough to leave behind a truth even death couldn't bury. And that night, I stood in the center of the empty living room, the same place I had once demanded answers, and I whispered a thank you to her, to myself, to whatever force had carried us both through this, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I felt seen. Peace, I've learned, doesn't arrive with the absence of noise or conflict. It seeps in slowly, like warm sunlight through old curtains. Barely noticed at first until one morning you realize your shoulders aren't clenched anymore, your breath comes easier, and the ache you carried like a second spine has finally begun to loosen its grip. That's how it felt returning to the house day after day, not with grandeur, not with revenge, but with quiet purpose, restoring what was mine not just in deed but in spirit, rebuilding something that had long been taken from me, not just a home, but a place where I could belong without apology. It started with small things, unpacking old boxes I hadn't dared open in years, finding my mother's handwritten recipes tucked inside the spine of a cookbook, a dried lilac from our old garden pressed between the pages like a secret, and slowly, as I opened each drawer, each forgotten corner, the house began to feel less like a courtroom exhibit and more like the life we were supposed to have had. The one where laughter echoed down hallways and someone's favorite mug was always waiting on the counter. I repainted the walls, nothing bold, just soft colors that reminded me of the mornings we used to share when everything felt possible and every stroke of the brush felt like reclaiming a part of myself I hadn't realized was missing. Jonah moved in not long after, his suitcase in one hand, a plant he insisted would lighten the place up in the other, and for the first time in years, the house began to hum with something alive, music playing softly on Saturday mornings, the clinking of dishes from dinners we cooked together, his laughter drifting from the study when he found a particularly ridiculous bug in his code. And it wasn't just love, it was safety, the kind that doesn't ask you to shrink, that doesn't flinch when you cry, that doesn't walk away when your grief speaks louder than your voice. My father didn't visit. Not yet. But he sent a letter, handwritten, no return address, just a single page that said, "I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you find what we couldn't." And for once, he signed it not with best, not with take care, but with the name I hadn't heard from him in years, Dad. I didn't write back. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because some things need time to sit still, to settle in the quiet, and for now, silence felt like the most honest response I could offer. And yet, I wasn't alone. Mia came by on weekends, always with wine and too many snacks, claiming she was there strictly for quality control as we redecorated the guest room. And every time she laughed or rolled her eyes at Jonah's bad playlist, I felt something warm take root in my chest, a gentle reminder that family isn't just who shares your blood, it's who stays, who sees, who believes in the version of you even you forget sometimes. So now, the house stands not just as a structure or a legal victory, but as a living thing, walls lined with memory, rooms filled with renewal, and windows that catch the morning light just right. It's not perfect. There are still shadows, but there is also warmth, presence, love. And the light is always on. If you had asked me a year ago what justice looked like, I might have pointed to a courtroom, to a judge with a gavel, to the language of law I've wrapped myself in for most of my adult life, the language that gave me rules, boundaries, something to hold on to when everything else was too uncertain. But I know better now. I know that justice is quieter, more personal. It lives not in the final ruling or in the headlines people forget by morning, but in the soft, steady voice inside you that says, "You are right to speak, you are brave to stay, and you are allowed to take up space in your own story." There's still pain. Of course, grief never really leaves you. It just changes its form. It becomes something you learn to carry alongside your joy, something that no longer drags behind you like a chain but moves with you like a shadow, always present, but no longer in control. I still miss my mother in ways that words fail to reach, in the quiet moments when I cook with a recipe she once scribbled on a napkin, in the scent of lavender in the late spring air that reminds me of her garden, in the sound of my own laugh that sometimes, just briefly, sounds like her sand. I think I always will. But now, the missing feels gentler, less like loss, and more like love that doesn't know where to go, so it lingers. I think about the little girl I was, the one who sat on her bed waiting for her father to knock on the door. The one who tried to earn love through silence and good behavior. The one who thought if she made herself smaller, she might finally be seen, and I want to hold her face in my hands and tell her, with everything I have now, you were never the problem, you were never invisible. They just chose not to look. And you never needed to disappear to deserve a place in your own family. If there's one thing I hope someone hears in all of this, it's this: speak anyway. Even when they tell you it's not worth the fight. Even when they say it's too late. Even when the people who hurt you wear smiles too polished to crack. Speak anyway, because your truth is not too heavy, your pain is not too loud, and your story is not too inconvenient to be told. You have the right to remember what they want you to forget. You have the right to rise. And if you ever find yourself sitting in a room full of people who share your blood but not your heart, know this: you can leave. You can build a different kind of family. You can stand up and walk away without turning into someone bitter, without becoming the villain in their narrative. You can grieve what should have been and still build something beautiful out of what's left. I did. And every day I open the door to that house. Every morning I wake up beside someone who sees me fully. Every quiet moment, I give myself permission to rest. I remind myself that this life, this love, this home, this peace wasn't given to me. It was claimed. And I will never apologize for it.